So with our State of the River, What Happens on Land Doesn't Stay on Land by Allison Gill. Sarah Gardner, would you please introduce our speaker?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Allison Gill talk today. Brief introduction for Allison. She is an ecosystem ecologist whose research focuses on how interactions between plants and microorganisms influence carbon and nutrient cycling in forest, grassland, and wetland soils. She received a BA from Mount Holyoke College, a PhD from Boston University, and was a Grand Challenges in Biology postdoctoral fellow at the University of Minnesota. She's been an assistant professor in the biology department at Williams since 2020, where she teaches courses in organismal biology and ecology. Please join me in welcoming Allison. I'm sorry we can't be in person, but welcome, Allison.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. And I will try to keep this as brief as possible. I'm sure a Zoom talk is not what people are exactly excited for this evening. But I'm going to speak today a little bit about how some of my work as an ecosystem ecologist, mostly in upland systems, can translate and apply to our thinking about the managing of local watersheds. And so much of what I'm going to talk about, at least tangentially, relates to my research program at Williams. And so I want to acknowledge that my student collaborators here at Williams, as well as my colleagues and collaborators from other institutions. And I'm also grateful for funding from a variety of sources. And so I am a terrestrial ecosystem ecologist, and I really focus on how interactions between plants and microorganisms influence the cycling of carbon and nutrients within terrestrial ecosystems. And I care about and I think about these processes because the way carbon particularly cycles in ecosystems is really important for defining the carbon balance of these important global carbon stores, as well as their potential to actually emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which is a greenhouse gas, and how these kind of processes change in the context of all of the ways in which we're changing environmental conditions. But this is a water resources group, so these questions are perhaps not central to your primary interests, but the resource cycles that happen in upland systems are often connected to watersheds via groundwater, and the water eventually makes its way down gravitational gradients to our local waterways, and ultimately into our river watersheds. And so I've pulled together a few ways in which I think are thinking about the kind of biogeochemical cycling in upland systems might relate to how we think about and manage at least connectivity between land and watersheds. And so I really just have a couple of examples to walk through today. And so often I'm thinking about nutrient fluxes within terrestrial ecosystems, often because within upland systems, resources like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are important nutrients for most biological organisms, often, especially in the temperate zone, constrain biological productivity. This is why we figured out that it's helpful to fertilize our agricultural fields. And often when, for example, we add extra nutrients to many of our upland systems, we get more biomass production. But what we can also trigger are things like leaky nutrient cycles that end up exporting some of the nutrients which are important for maintaining production on land to our local waterways, where the constraints on production are somewhat different, and we can actually get an overproduction of some particular types of photosynthetic organisms, typically our surface level algae within our watersheds, that can lead to some kind of some downstream problems. And we know this actually from some experimental work going back to the 60s and 70s. These are experimental lakes in southern Canada, where nitrogen and phosphorus have been added to particular lakes for many decades. And what we find when you add phosphorus in particular to these lakes is that you get a major bloom of surface level algae within these lakes. They're taking up carbon dioxide. That's a carbon carbon sink. But what's happening is that they're basically shading the watershed, and so we get a reduction in the photic zone within the watershed, and often generate a situation in which the plant production cannot be maintained to a particular depth. We also get decomposition of the dying algae that are produced at the surface of the lake. And this can lead to ultimately to a situation of oxygen, basically depletion within the water. And many people are probably familiar with this, with information about things like the dead zone within the Gulf of Mexico, which is a product of the nutrient inputs that come in through the Mississippi watershed and contribute to overall anoxia within these watersheds. Many organisms within freshwater require oxygen for their own biological needs. And so dead zones that are produced in some cases over the course of a summer, even in northern systems close to us, can generate situations such as fish kills. And so creating situations in which we put a lock on export of nutrients from upland, forests and grasslands and things like that to our local watersheds is really kind of a win-win for both production on land as well as maintaining healthy waterways. And so what I'm going to speak about for a few minutes is just a few kind of strategies that come up related to research of myself and my colleagues about how we can try to kind of better keep nutrients in terrestrial landscapes rather than having them move to the waterways. And I'm going to just provide examples thinking about this, these processes in forests, in grasslands and fields, as well as in our municipal city streets. And so first of all, I think a lot about the soil. And so I just wanted to briefly note a couple of functional things about how soils work and how that relates to nutrient kind of export and fluxes. So soils are built with a mixture of mineral particles and organic materials. So this is dying and decaying, mostly plant-derived materials. And one key thing about these structures within soils is that both clay particles, which are one of the sources of minerals within soils, as well as much of the organic material within soils, maintain net negative surface charges. They're slightly negatively charged, and that influences what kind of things want to stick to these particles in soils. And so within soils, some nutrients have positive charges. We call these cations, and positively charged nutrients like ammonium, as well as a lot of metal cations like calcium and potassium, which are both important for cell function, stick pretty effectively in soils because they have a positive charge and they stick onto the soil particles. Other forms of nutrients like nitrate, which is another form of nitrogen, as well as phosphate, which is the dominant form of phosphorus, have negative charges, which the tricky thing is that these negatively charged anions don't have a great capacity to stick into soils and tend to wash out pretty easily into waterways. And so nitrogen in particular has these two kind of dominant inorganic forms, which are the forms that are kind of the most biologically active within soil systems. And so it probably makes sense that we want to think about ways to keep our nitrogen as ammonium rather than letting it get into this nitrate form. And we can think a little bit about how nitrogen is produced in soils in order to kind of consider those controls. So the initial form of nitrate within the soil nitrogen, the initial form of nitrogen within the soil nitrogen cycle is actually just decaying organic material. Leaves and things like that have proteins in their tissues which contain nitrogen. And decomposer microbes use this dying plant material as both a carbon and a nitrogen source, and end up producing a particular form of nitrogen called ammonium, which is positively charged. This positively charged ammonium can be used by plants, sucked up by plants for their own nitrogen source, as well as used by other decomposer microbes to fuel their own nitrogen demand. And so in situations where we have a soil and that has lots of plants that want the ammonium that's available, as well as lots of decomposer microbes that are also sucking up this ammonium, we have a nice tight nitrogen cycle that is keeping things in the positively charged form that has is relatively good at sticking in the soil. Situations in which we get leftover ammonium allows autotrophic microbes, which use carbon dioxide as a carbon source to build their own carbohydrate biomass and produce actually nitrate, this negatively charged nitrogen, as a byproduct, come in when there's excess ammonium that the plants and the decomposer microbes are not using. And so this nitrate production and the production of kind of nitrogen that is not easily retained in soils often reflects a situation in which there's not enough biological demand, and we have kind of excess that is at risk of moving towards waterways. And so this kind of gives us a picture that building situations in which plant and decomposer microbe nitrogen demand is relatively high, create situations where we can kind of try to mitigate nitrate production. And relatively straightforward strategies of things like using approaches that help maintain organic matter pools, so maintaining carbon sources for decomposer microbes, such as the use of cover crops on fields, can be a good strategy to reduce nitrate, potential nitrate losses. Other things like when we have selective biomass harvesting within forests, doing that in sort of responsible ways that don't fully kind of knock out the potential for plant nitrogen uptake, if we kind of clear cut a particular area, can also help mitigate nitrate losses. This is work that we actually did at a continental scale with colleagues both at Williams as well as some other institutions. And we see this certainly in forests around Massachusetts, but also this kind of applies to a continental gradient. But the fact is we also have nitrate that's just sometimes gets produced. We have situations in which biological ammonium demand is temporarily low and the system shifts towards nitrate production. So how can we build situations that also allow nitrate to potentially get used by plants before it leaches out to the waterways? If it can get taken up by plants or microbes quickly after it's produced, we can still kind of mitigate the effect of nitrate leaching towards waterways. And so the strategy there would be just building systems that can keep the nitrate that they make. And one of the best ways to generate systems that are more effective at using nitrate is actually increasing the biodiversity of the particular system. And we can see this in a relatively kind of intuitive way if we just look at the root system of a bunch of different particular plants. I'm from the Midwest, so I'm very comfortable thinking about prairie plants. But when you look at a bunch of different prairie plants, they have very diverse root systems that are exploiting different particular niches within their ecological environment and are able to access distinct nitrogen pools. And logically, it makes sense that this particular system would be good at fully exploiting the nitrate pools that might be present at a particular time. But we also know from experiments that this is also the case. So this is the big biodiversity experiment at the University of Minnesota. These plots are actually 10 by 10 meters. The little squares, kind of postage stamps, are about 10 by 10 meters in diameter and are planted with different groupings of different plants that are communities of varying levels of biodiversity. And one kind of brief takeaway from this particular experiment is that in plots that have a greater number of species, so this is the number of species on the x-axis here, we have those plots are able to better exploit the nitrate that's in the rooting zone and basically suck it up better, maintaining lower total nitrate loads in the soil at any particular point, and kind of reducing the amount of nitrate that actually moves from the soil to the surrounding groundwater, which in Minnesota would be the Mississippi River. And so building upland communities that can better suck up the nitrate before it gets to the river helps us prevent those kind of downstream effects of dead zones and things like that. Then finally, the phosphorus side of this, one thing that you might note in this kind of soil cartoon is that our primary form of biologically available phosphorus is actually always negatively charged. And phosphorus is a tricky one in terms of maintaining both the kind of balance of phosphorus availability in order to kind of maintain biological productivity on land, while also not letting it leak out at too high a rate. So the primary biological form of phosphorus available in systems is phosphate. Some of you may be familiar with phosphate and add it to things like your gardens in the form of orthophosphate, but this is super negatively charged. So it really likes to wash out in water and really contributes to these major algal blooms within a lot of our freshwater systems. And we actually kind of already cleaned up part of our phosphorus problem. Phosphorus was widely used in detergents as a surfactant in the 70s and 80s. And we had really high phosphorus spikes over those decades. Various legislation in most states has removed phosphates from most detergents, and this has actually really cut down phosphorus export to watersheds, but it's not zero. And actually today, one of our dominant forms of phosphorus export to watersheds is actually municipal waste from cities. And so I mean like organic waste from streets. So this is work led by my colleague Sarah Hobby at the University of Minnesota, where they've done a lot of work looking at what is the form of phosphorus that's actually getting from the city to the groundwater and into the watershed. And it's really phosphorus that's coming from things like grass clippings and leaves and other kind of organic matter that's moving through the storm drain system from city streets into the watershed. All of this organic material has phosphorus in its DNA, and it's getting moved in that way. And this is actually the dominant kind of export form in these cities. These leaves would typically be a really important carbon and nutrient source when they're falling onto something like the forest floor. But when they're falling onto an impervious surface in a city and then getting basically shunted into a storm drain, that is a kind of a different functional story. And so one kind of relatively straightforward strategy we can take there is more sort of targeted efforts to actually street sweep leaves before they're moved into storm drain systems and transfer them to some kind of municipal compost operation that is somewhat separate from direct export immediately to watersheds in order to mitigate the phosphorus export. And so those are just three brief kind of ways in which we can think about how our land-based kind of interactions with nutrient cycling can potentially constrain the downstream effect of these nutrients on aquatic systems. And I'm happy to take any questions people have.
People have any questions? I am not seeing if I'm not seeing any. Let's see.
Well, here's a question, if I could.
Great.
So if I'm out in the woods in the spring and I smell ammonia, is that an indication that there isn't sufficient plant life sucking the?
Yeah, so the spring is actually quite a active time for nitrogen cycling because often so right now, for example, or last week, the decomposer microbes can turn on their biological activity quite easily in response to temperature, but plant uptake of the nitrogen that they're producing, the inorganic nitrogen, is often slower to respond. And so certainly the spring is often kind of a moment of really active inorganic nitrogen production. And if biological uptake is not matched with that, that is a moment in which you can get a lot of net export of nitrogen from the soil to the groundwater and ultimately to aquatic systems. Also things like our reduced soil frost in these regions, because we have less snow than we used to, contributes to more intense root damage, because snow is sort of an insulator blanket. And so typically the trees are also taking longer to recover from these sort of damage-inducing freeze-thaw cycles that are happening over the winter. And so that is also kind of slowing down biological nitrogen uptake early in the spring.
Thank you.
Martha, and then Laura B, and then Allison Dixon.
Hi, Allison. Thanks for giving the talk. I was wondering about the leaf cleanup in the fall. I don't think I've ever seen a leaf truck here in Williamstown. I used to see them in Brookline in Eastern Mass.
Mm-hmm.
So how much of how much resistance do towns have, and how costly is that kind of cleanup compared to what's the bang for buck?
Yeah, I mean, I think most major cities have pretty active street sweeping cleanups. I mean, I know one thing, for example, the Twin Cities have gotten much more on top of is trying to really closely triangulate when particular streets get street swept with the dates at which most of either the leaves are falling in the fall or the samaras are falling. And there's also a major pulse that happens in the spring with the production of samaras and a lot of reproductive tissue. And so like some cities are trying to really kind of carefully triangulate those particular like phenological moments with when the trucks go down the street. I agree that I think I'm relatively new in Williamstown. I don't know that that's like a major kind of municipal focus here. I also often notice a lot of very clogged street drains around Williamstown. In previous cities that I've been in, there have also been more kind of grassroots efforts among neighbors to like adopt storm drains and things like that to help prevent organic matter from getting into those drains. But I mean, I don't have data on this, but almost certainly the predominant phosphorus export from Williamstown is through like organic waste, basically.
Laura B had asked, reducing use of fertilizers on lawns would also help. Yes. And then the second part of the question, lawn fertilizers leach into water systems, question mark?
Yes, certainly, anytime you're adding fertilizer over biological, like the capacity of plants to take it up immediately, that's going to also help for sure.
Okay, Allison Dixon and then John Case.
Sorry. Thank you. Wonderful information right down my alley. I appreciate the explanation. We river people, waterfront people are always pushing to improve riparian buffers, lakefront and riverfront. Do you have any recommendations or resources? I mean, we like a buffer 25 feet or more or less, but I know lakefront owners, they really don't want to obscure their view with shrubs and trees. And I'm wondering, is it enough just to encourage them to grow some perennials that may still reduce the nutrient input to the lakes?
I mean, anything is better. And like any kind of biological, so the worst would be like some kind of like gravel beach or something like that. And then you can go up from there. Grass is better than a gravel beach, and certainly like a complex shrubby kind of buffer zone is an opportunity basically for when nitrate starts leaching out of the forest for it to have another chance to get absorbed before it actually makes it into the water. And so like a more complex biological community is going to provide a more effective buffer for sure. But of course you get into things like, property owner rights and those sorts of things. Many cities are recognizing that these wetland buffers also are really important kind of supports of flood control. And so there are some just kind of practical benefits of like zoning regulations supporting the maintenance of these wetland buffer zones. And so that's kind of creates another win-win opportunity.
Yeah, I think we struggle where there's grass up to the lakefront and it's grandfathered and they don't have to do anything.
Right, yeah. And grass is
different.
better than, I guess, dirt, but
Yeah. And as far as the street sweeping, I know for the what we call the MS4 communities where they're mandated to improve their stormwater management, I think they're a little more rigid with their street sweeping, but they still, even in Pittsfield, I don't see enough street sweeping, no, as far as I'm concerned. We need to do more.
yeah, that's definitely an important, like, and relatively straightforward area of focus.
John Case, and I have a question from Allison Perlman.
You mentioned leaves in particular. How big a problem are grass cuttings, and are communities doing anything to mitigate the problem with grass cuttings?
So I think grass cuttings are a pretty big component. So in the Twin Cities, which is where we have the data, grass cuttings are quite a large component of the phosphorus export as well. And it certainly, like, some municipalities have explicit policies about how organic waste is dealt with within residential areas in order to, reduce the amount of grass cuttings that are getting into the stormwater system. But it in certain situations can be a significant component of phosphorus export for sure.
Allison Perlman asks, how does green infrastructure systems play into the solutions?
So I guess related to Allison Dixon's previous question is, any opportunity to basically, so like the kind of biological issue is situations in which, nitrate production in soils exceeds biological uptake of nitrogen. And so any kind of situation, any sort of infrastructure that I guess does some combination of two things. One is slow water down as it moves from upland systems to watersheds. So situations that that kind of enable more infiltration of the water rather than facilitating overland flow. So the situations like reducing the kind of amount of impervious surfaces within residential areas or municipalities would certainly basically create more time opportunities for plants or microbes to take up that nitrogen on its way towards waterways, but then also coupling that with infrastructure that is could itself actually take up could actually take up the nitrogen as well. In the Midwest, so another place, and this maybe couples with the fertilizer question, another, obviously in agricultural systems, where we do have to fertilize agricultural systems in order to maintain, you have to add nutrients back in some form in order to maintain production if you're removing biomass year after year. Those can be certainly hotspots for nitrate export. And there, I guess a form of green infrastructure would be that some Midwestern states incentivize the installation of what are called nitrogen bioreactors, which sound kind of more technological than they are. And they're really just like ditches filled with wood chips in order to basically give microbes a carbon source that they can use in combination with the nitrate that moves across these ditches in the wastewater in order to immobilize that nitrate before the wastewater actually moves towards the watershed. So that's another example of infrastructure to help kind of engineer opportunities to reduce nutrient export.
Sarah Gardner, then I have another question over here on the chat.
Yes, Allison, that was so interesting. I love hearing you talk about all this stuff. I just think I and others might be very interested to hear about your research. Could you give us sort of a nutshell about your current research?
Sure. So most of my research focuses on the process, basically the coupled processes of litter decomposition and soil organic matter formation. So a bit, a big piece of mitigating nitrate export is building soil organic matter. And so a lot of what my research lab focuses on is how soil organic matter is formed and how it's stabilized and the time scale over which it cycles. And we do a lot of work at Hopkins Forest, looking at across basically a geological gradient up the mountain, how soil organic matter is formed and how that differs in low elevation areas that have relatively more neutral pH soils versus higher elevation areas. And we're trying to understand how nitrogen inputs kind of interact with these processes to better predict how soil carbon pools will change in the future, basically, is a kind of maybe a high level piece. We also think a little bit about how plant communities interact, like the composition of plant communities and how they interact with the process, basically biogeochemical cycling across the landscape, as well as how different types of decomposers facilitate organic matter formation. Not terribly organized explanation, but those are some of the major projects happening.
Great.
I've got two questions here in the chat. The first one is, the photo in the middle is so beautiful. Maybe we can convince some lakefront landowners to include pollinator meadows at lakefronts too. And that she's asking as a question. We are going to be doing some, Hoorah is going to be doing some bank stabilization workshops, which would include more woody material. As Allison Dixon was replying to her, that would help even more with lakefront erosion and also riverfront erosion. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Allison? Gill, is there anything else that you'd want to add? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I guess, yeah, so having woody vegetation along lakefronts, supports that minimizes erosion, can also help with that process of slowing water down and maximizing opportunities for nitrogen uptake. So that certainly interacts with the overall goals here.
Susan Abrams asks, how do excess phosphorus impact composting?
So having too much phosphorus within a compost heap is maybe the question. It's similar to that would be a relatively uncommon situation, just because phosphorus has basically easily leaches out of systems. So I'm having trouble thinking of a situation in which like the biggest problem in a compost pile would be too much phosphorus. But it's certain, like basically when you have excess nutrient availability in one kind of direction or another, it can certainly select for different decomposer communities. And I guess top of mind is it might select for a decomposer community that's less basically biochemically able to degrade the more recalcitrant or more like difficult to chew on organic molecules within the compost pile. So you may slow down the rate at which you break down like woody material, for example.
Margaret McCornish asks, are there local initiatives to curb the spread of knotweed, and what are your thoughts?
So knotweed is, I mean, so I guess one kind of, here's a conundrum, right? So knotweed is a noxious invasive plant. It also is very good at sucking up nitrogen in riparian areas. And so certainly knotweed is reducing the biodiversity of the riparian areas in which it's established. And I don't know about like local initiatives explicitly, but certainly many communities are have some efforts to reduce the spread of knotweed, or certainly like 10 or 15 years ago. I don't know if people are feeling more like the horses out of the barn on that one at this point. But it probably is doing some heavy work on sucking up nitrate on its way to the water too. So there's that side of it.
Because they're so invasive, I was actually thinking about having a cook-off because they're also a wild edible. So in the
Right,
springtime,
yeah.
we could a bunch of us foragers can get together and have a cook-off and see what recipes you like.
Mhm.
All right, any other questions? I see Allison Dixon's hand still raised, and also Sarah's. I don't know if you just hadn't unraised it or if you had another question, either one of you. Nope, okay. All right. And any other questions? Nope. So it doesn't look like we've got any other questions. So thank you so much, Allison Gill, for your time and energy and your presentation. We really appreciate you participating and facilitating the State of the River component of our annual meeting.
Yes, I'd like to interject. Thank you for such a nice presentation. I appreciate Sarah orchestrating this to bring it to this forefront of discussion. Thank you so much. I'm down towards the end of the agenda. I do want to thank everyone for attending this year. And again, I want to thank you for the participation. And as much as we did want to meet face to face, this was our second best choice, and it seems to have worked reasonably well. And I do want to thank you. So thank you for attending, and board members, if you can slowly exit and go to another hyperlink, so we can conduct a regular meeting thereafter, I would appreciate that. But again, thank you. Hoosic River Watershed does live on, and we're doing many good things out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison.